The topic we're looking at today are the Latin American independence movements of the early 1800s. And on the screen, you'll see a mural actually done by a Mexican artist. And murals are fairly popular in especially Mexican art. And at the center of this one, you see one of the main leaders of their revolutionary movement, Father Hidalgo. He was a Catholic priest who exemplifies some of the really interesting aspects of Latin American independence, namely the aspect of social inequality and different views on what independence and freedom would really look like for people. Father Hidalgo was a leader um, of mostly lower class people who were fighting for more revolutionary change than was desired by the upper classes, especially the Creoles. And you can kind of see over here some examples of Creole leaders of independence. And Creole leaders in Latin America, throughout Latin America, not just in Mexico, but throughout Latin America, Creole leaders had very similar ideas about what they wanted out of independence to the American founding fathers. They were looking for economic liberties to be released from the mercantilist system of their colonial power that formerly owned them. They were looking for secure property rights, and they were looking for a voice in government that they didn't feel that they had currently. They were not looking in any way, shape, or form for a social revolution that would install equality among the classes. And this mural might look familiar to some of you guys. If you've already looked at the DBQ documents, um, for the essay that we're going to take a look at, hopefully sometime quite soon. Um, and this, I think, does a really nice job of just sort of depicting that deep divide between classes and that difference that people really saw in what their goal was for their revolutions. Was it freedom or was it equality? And Father Hidalgo will actually end up dead because of his desire to sort of move toward equality, and he was very upsetting for the social order of the day, and a lot of lower class people who lived in Mexico would have to wait until another revolution in the early 1900s to sort of get a chance to really realize equality. So in the early 1800s, what we're going to see is independence movements and a desire for the kind of government that you see evolving in the very early United States. All right, let's go ahead and do a little bit of backdrop first. Please remember that Spain and Portugal were the primary holders of territory in the Americas, and they had a number of colonies. They owned, this kind of cuts off, but they actually owned all the way up basically to modern Oregon, all this Florida, the Caribbean, and then down into South America, so all this in North America, then down into South America, while Brazil was held by the Portuguese. They also had a very peculiar social hierarchy that we've been talking about. Remember, Peninsulares were way up at the top. Those are Spaniards. Usually they were sent over to govern the colonies. It was felt by Spain that the colony should not be governed even by Spaniards who were born in the Americas. They felt that the colony, if it was going to benefit the mother country, as mercantilism's ideas sort of stressed, then it needed to be governed by a native Spaniard. Next up, you had Creoles. Creoles were Europeans, but they were born in the New World. So Spaniards, in all sense of the word, ethnically, but not really in terms of their culture. They're very much steeped in the values that came with being born in the Americas. You had mestizos, people of mixed background, usually Amerindian and European, and mulattoes who had African in their background. And this was especially prominent in Brazil and the Caribbean. If you guys will remember, those areas were sugar colonies producing sugar, so they had a lot of forced immigration of Africans to work that sugar. And Native Americans and Africans sort of made up the bulk of the population, and they tended to sort of dominate the lower classes. So that was our background. Remember, Spain Spain and Portugal ruled the Americas through the system of the viceroy, which is direct control. And I'd also like you to add into that information that the church, the Catholic Church, had a huge influence on Latin America in this time period. So culturally, it's sort of what bound all the groups together, and the church was extremely powerful in terms of the political and economic sway that it held over those colonies. Okay, we're going to go straight into causes for these revolutions. We've got a number of causes or factors that led Latin America to seek. Sorry, I forgot that was in there. to seek independence. Sorry. All right. First is the Enlightenment, and this is the thing that holds true for every single one of our independence movements in the Atlantic. The Enlightenment, with its ideas of natural rights, especially, and the social contract of Rousseau, the idea that people should have a say in their government and that they intentionally give up some power to the government if the government doesn't rule according to the best interests of the population, then the population has the right or ability to overthrow it. So those ideas were extremely important. In addition, there were ideas about how government should be set up. In class, we talked about Montesquieu and Voltaire. Voltaire had the idea of religious toleration and freedom of speech. And Montesquieu had really the kind of core kernel of how our government in the United States is set up today, with his idea of the balance of and separation of powers. And Simón Bolívar, who you guys should know about from your both textbook reading and DBQ reading, really admired the federal system that the United States was able to put into place in the late 1780s. After its sort of failed attempt under the Articles of Confederation, we finally hashed out the current Constitution. And that's really what a federal system is. It's state governments under the central control of a federal or national government. So if you would out to the side of federal system, just note that a federal system means that you have state governments and a national government. And what a lot of people in Latin America wanted to do, especially sort of upper class Creoles, they wanted to create an independent South America, and they wanted to create one large state called Gran Colombia. And this is the part where we learn that Disney is a big fat liar, and really your dreams don't come true, because Simón Bolívar has this one beautiful dream of Gran Colombia, and his dream comes true for about 5 seconds and then falls apart almost immediately. So we'll talk about that in just a little bit. It's a bit of a downer. Definitely Latin America, just like North America, resented the mercantilist policies of their colonial overlords, for lack of a better word. They did not want to exist for the benefit economically of the mother country. They wanted to exist for the benefit of themselves. There was also, uniquely for Latin America, so I'd like you to put a little star beside this one, there was a lot of social inequality in the colonies. Definitely Peninsulares, that top portion of the population, among them the viceroy, were very much the elites and very much in charge. There was a document in the DBQ, let's see, that talked about, it was document B, actually, I'll just read it for you real quick. It says, one of the main sources of independence sentiment was the growing rivalry between Creoles and Peninsulares. The Creoles had growing economic and social influence, but the Peninsulares monopolized all administrative positions. For example, in 1807, only 12 of 99 judges in Latin America were held by Creoles. The rest were held by Peninsulares. So basically, the Creoles didn't have any political power. They were not in positions where they could make decisions about their colony's future, and they were very resentful of that. I should say as well that the underclass, the lower classes of people in Latin America, were very resentful of the prominence and economic power of Creoles. So there was definitely tension going both up and down the social hierarchy. The thing that really puts the nail in the coffin for Latin America, though, is a crisis back home in Spain. So I'd like you to double underline that phrase. There's a crisis back in Spain that actually instigates the revolution. In 1808, Napoleon invades Spain and Portugal. Napoleon is, as you'll recall, hopefully, the non-short leader of the later part of the French Revolution, and he actually installed himself as emperor and went on to conquer a lot of continental Europe, including Spain and Portugal, where he fought a very long series of wars that didn't go very well for him. And he invaded Spain and Portugal. He sticks his brother on the throne, and this is sort of the moment. Creoles realize that there is a power vacuum. I hope that you guys remember the concept of legitimacy, a government, or the belief that a government has the right to rule. Most people in Latin America, right up through about 1800, really believed in the legitimacy of the Spanish monarchy. However, if you just pluck the long-term ruling family of Spain out of Spain, they actually fled the country. And if you just sort of plunk some random dude down, like Napoleon did with his brother, then he is not going to have the kind of legitimacy as a monarch that a long-term reigning royal family would have. So what the Creoles realized is that there was a power vacuum and there was a crisis of legitimacy. So if you would note out to the side of that second bullet point, please note that the monarchy had a crisis of legitimacy. And they wanted to get control of the colonies. The DBQ implied that the Creoles actually, or one of the documents implied, that the Creoles were actually worried in this moment that the lower classes would take that crisis of legitimacy as an opportunity actually to seize power for themselves. And this is not what the Creoles wanted to happen. The Creoles were okay with the social order of European people up at the top of the social hierarchy and in a dominant role. They just wanted to replace the Peninsulares with themselves and continue the repressive policies toward the rest of the population. The rest of the population definitely didn't have that same sort of desire. The rest of the population was gearing more toward a desire for equality. And in Latin America, as we'll see, that's going to mean land. The ownership of land is going to be hugely important throughout the history of Latin America. And who owns the land, in many cases, up until fairly recently, will determine who's in a position of social, political, and economic power. Okay, Brazil will actually, in this moment, kind of transition to independence fairly easily. The Spanish colonies do not, however. I'll tell you the quick story about what happens in Brazil. Pretty much Napoleon invades Portugal, and the royal family flees to Brazil, where they set up their royal court. And things roll along for Napoleon back in Europe not very well. He invades Russia, most of his army dies, it's terrible, and finally he is beaten. Napoleon is beaten by British and a group of coalition forces at the Battle of Waterloo in modern-day Belgium. And in that moment, the reigning family of Portugal realizes that they can go back home. They have their country back. And in that moment, the king of Portugal decides that he kind of chats it over with his son. I think the son is Pedro the First. So you can sort of think of the king as kind of, I don't know, helping his son out a little bit. And he just says to his son, hey, why don't you stay here in Brazil and declare independence? We know that things are going to kind of go that way anyway, so why don't we keep it all in the family? You can be the king of Brazil, I'll be the king of Portugal. It's all good, and that's the path that Brazil took. It was pretty easy. They didn't have to have a big war or anything like that. So Brazil transitions to independence from Portugal, but the Spanish colonies from the western portion of what is today the United States on down does not transition very well. So let's first talk about South America, and then we'll talk about Mexico. South America, in many ways, their independence movement is dominated by this guy in the hilarious outfit, Simon Bolivar. And he's sort of the George Washington figure of South America. He begins a revolutionary movement in 1810, and his goal, again, is to unite Latin America under one state that he wants to call Gran Colombia. And he sort of leads the northern South America portion. He is, I believe, from Venezuela, and he leads these modern countries in a fight for independence. Of course, they are not countries at the time that he leads them in their independence movement. But he is a military leader. He is a Creole. You can see he's got a sword. He's got his like military boots on, his military jacket. So he's definitely a military leader. And he refers in a kind of confusing document, document A, he refers to the Spaniards as invaders. So I'd like to just sort of bring up his document because I was afraid that a lot of people didn't understand it just based on what I got back from you on your DBQ document analysis. In document A, which is from Simon Bolivar, in a speech that he gave, he said, "We are not Europeans, we are not Indians. We are but a mixed species of aborigines," by which he means like Native Americans and Spaniards. "Americans by birth and Europeans by law, we find ourselves engaged in a dual conflict. We are disputing with the natives for titles of ownership, and at the same time we are struggling to maintain ourselves in the country that gave us birth against the opposition of the invaders. Thus our position is most extraordinary and complicated." So he kind of defines the issue that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture right there in that passage. He says that they are struggling with the natives, by which he means Native Americans, for titles of ownership, aka land. So he mentions very clearly that the lower classes would like to get their hands on land, aka money and power. And then he also says that they're struggling against invaders. And by invaders, he at this point means the Spanish. And that's a really important word that he uses. This speech was given in 1819, so quite a while later, after the beginning of the Revolution. And in that time period, Latin Americans have transitioned. They used to think of themselves sort of as Spaniards, in the same way that people who become Americans thought of themselves as British before the American Revolution. And sometime in that fight, the Creoles and other Latin Americans began to think of themselves as a different group. And this is a really, really important moment that illustrates a concept that we'll be talking about a whole lot in time period 5, which is nationalism. So, nationalism is just a term, and you guys have already seen it, I think, in your reading questions. It just means that you feel a sense of belonging or community with a group, usually within the boundaries of a country called a nation. And we'll talk more about what qualities sort of define nationalism, but it's going to be a hugely, hugely influential force right up through to the present day. He calls on all classes at first to unite. He says that he will free slaves, for example. So he's trying to, in the beginning of the revolution, pull all Latin Americans along toward a desire for independence. However, again, his real goal and his real worry is that the lower classes will try to, in their status as the majority of people, try to take power away from the Creoles. He does manage to establish a united South America called Gran Colombia for a period of several years, but it will eventually fall apart into different states. I think oftentimes we forget how large Latin America is, but you're talking about a very, very large land area. Um, just Brazil alone is almost the same size as the United States if you chop off Alaska. So you're talking about a lot of land to pull together under one national identity, and it just does not work, and it will fall apart into different states with different national identities. The other big revolutionary leader is Jose de San Martin, and he leads the revolution in southern South America, mainly in Argentina and then Chile. He is very similar, you can see in his portrait, to Bolivar. He's a military man, he's a Creole, he's of European descent, and he will not only help Argentina and Chile, he also crossed the border into Ecuador, where he and Bolivar, who's moving down from the north, sort of meet up. And by 1825, through military action, South America is liberated from Spanish rule. And here you can see Bolivar and San Martin meeting up in Ecuador in 1822. And that sort of is the moment when Latin America is free of Spanish control, at least in the South America portion. I think that you've got this map on your notes. It's a really good graphic. It tells you really quickly what happened and when and who got independence at what point. All right, let's talk about Mexico. Mexican independence, the fight for independence begins in 1810, and it's definitely a perfect example of that friction between the social classes. And it actually begins, and this is very unusual, so I'd like you to star it. It begins with the lower class. This is the only time in our revolutions that we're going to be studying right now when the lower class is the one that takes charge. In the French Revolution, the revolution began with the upper classes within the Estates General breaking off and doing the tennis court oath to form the National Assembly. In the United States, the independence movement began with the upper classes, people that we know of as the Founding Fathers. In Haiti, which we'll be studying next, the revolution also begins among the elites within the society before it becomes a slave revolt later. So Mexico is very unusual in that the lower classes are the ones driving that push toward independence. Father Hidalgo, the guy who I showed you in the mural at the very beginning of this lecture, who is a priest, a Catholic priest, he leads a lower class-based movement to try to take power. Now, of course, it doesn't end well, but we have a little bit of a document from him in a speech that he gave. He said to the people that he was hoping to lead in the revolt, he said, "My children, a new dispensation comes to us today. Will you receive it? Will you free yourselves?" And I think that's a really important concept. Will you free yourselves? Will you recover the lands stolen 300 years ago from your forefathers by the hated Spaniards? And there it is again, that issue of land. And so what I'd like you all to note out to the side of that third bullet point where it says to take power, I want you to note that in this context, power equals land. Mostly what the lower class will continue to demand throughout Latin America is land, and land will continue to be, up until the early 1900s, and even after that, land will continue to be dominated by Creoles and other elites. The Creoles and Peninsulares were not okay with Father Hidalgo's movement. They use an army to put down the lower class movement. Hidalgo is executed. His right-hand man, another priest named Morelos, actually picks up the fight. And in Mexico, there are three groups that are fighting. Poor Mexicans, upper class Mexicans, and Spain. And you had a really messy period of several years when these various groups were trying to outmaneuver one another to gain power. Morelos is a really interesting character. I think he's really far ahead of his time in terms of what he was seeking. He wanted to abolish slavery, and he wanted to conduct land reform. And in this sense, land reform was redistribution, aka taking land from the upper classes and giving land to the peasants. And this should sound vaguely like communism, although as a theory, communism did not yet exist. The idea that somehow justice would be served by taking away the property of those who had a lot and sort of divvying it up among the lower classes so that everybody would have a little bit was definitely an idea that was circulating even before Karl Marx wrote and published his Communist Manifesto in 1848. I have a quote here from Morelos. He said, "We demand a new government by which all inhabitants except Peninsulares would no longer be designated as Indians, mulattoes, or castas, people of mixed race, but all would be known as Americans." And that is a really, really nice example of a sentiment about national identity. So he wants to make his identity and the identity of his fellow Latin Americans based on their nationhood rather than their ethnic group. And that's a very different thing than what we saw in the historical past. Most people usually identified with a religious group or an ethnic group or saw themselves as the subject of a monarch. And this is a big transitional moment in history when people begin to understand themselves as being members of a nation. In 1815, Morelos is also captured and executed by the upper classes, and the revolution after that point becomes securely held by the Creoles. In the end, another Creole, Augustin de Iturbide, is going to be the guy who sort of comes out on top. He will lead Mexico to independence from Spain, which they'll achieve in 1820. However, most Creoles were very afraid at this point of the lower classes, and they were very willing to allow the military to install Iturbide as a emperor. And I'm using the word emperor sort of with a grain of salt. That was his title, emperor. However, he doesn't really have that sort of family name or legitimacy that old European monarchs had, that sort of idea of divine right or my family's always been ruling or whatever. He sort of claims power by virtue of being able to control the military. And in many ways, that's not really an emperor. They don't gain their legitimacy through tradition. They gain their legitimacy by having power and military force. And I think of those people more as dictators. So right away from the get-go, because of that social division in Mexico, you get a government that is supported by the military through force and is headed up by someone who in many ways looks like a dictator. So these are going to be issues that we'll see for a long time in Latin America, and we're going to go through a few issues. First, Latin America is going to have a problem now that it has become independent with having shallow economies or monocrop, one-crop economies. Latin America was set up, remember, under mercantilism as a place that was geared to benefit the mother country of Spain or Portugal. That means that primarily they were involved in the exporting of raw materials, whether it was silver or sugar or whatever agricultural product. So when the time came to become independent, the economy stumbled a lot, and it was very shallow because the whole economy was geared to produce and sell cash crops, which have sort of a low value as opposed to manufactured goods. So Latin America will struggle right through till the 1900s with creating dynamic and diverse economies that are able to produce more than just raw materials. They also have a problem with this because please remember that the upper classes held almost all of the land, and the upper classes were doing very well because if you have enough land and you export enough low value raw materials, you're still going to be really rich. The problem was that the whole country wasn't rich. Just a very few number of people up at the very top of the social hierarchy who held all the land were rich. So they're not, those people up at the top who owned all the land aren't going to have like a good reason to transition the economies of Latin America to something more diverse, dynamic, like manufacturing. So they've kind of got a double whammy. First, they were set up as colonies to produce raw materials, and then after independence, the upper classes are making good money off of producing raw materials. They just don't have dynamic enough economies that the wealth trickles down to anyone else. So that will be a very long-term problem. They've also got that problem of land, and I want you to put a big llama beside land redistribution. Landless peasants, mostly mestizos, Amerindians, will remain a big problem. There will be a lot of peasants who sort of continue to reside on the margins of society. They lack political power, they lack economic opportunities, and they will want a piece of land so that they can raise themselves up economically. And the fact that the upper classes hold so much land and are unwilling to relinquish it is going to be a very long-term problem that in Mexico will lead to another revolution in 1910 and 11. All right, the power of the Catholic Church, interestingly, is not really impacted a lot by the revolutions. As you saw with Father Hidalgo and Morelos, both of them were Catholic Church priests, and a lot of the national identity of Latin American countries comes from the unity in terms of Catholic religion that most people hold. And that still remains very strong today. Most people from Latin America are Catholic still today. The other problem, and I want you to put a big llama beside this one too, are these guys called caudillos. A caudillo is a military leader, but they have very large amounts of personal popularity. So Iturbide is a great example of a caudillo. So you might as well go ahead and jot Iturbide's name out to the side of that word caudillo as well, so that you've sort of got an example of one that you can pull out if needed. Because of that tension between the upper and the lower classes, usually the upper classes, although their ideals are Enlightenment ideals, they would like to have freedom, they would like to have natural rights for all citizens of their nations. They're a little bit afraid of what the lower class will do because they're in the majority. So instead of moving toward greater democracy, what you get in Latin America a lot is rulers who are caudillos. They're military leaders. They're very popular personally, but in essence, you've got dictators. And people are sort of willing to take that compromise between sort of greater democracy and stability, because they prefer stability. Nobody wants to have a revolution and armies wandering the countryside. Yeah, it's not a very good way to have a good life. So caudillos actually become a big problem, and you'll see caudillos ruling much of Latin America for most of the 1800s. So because of Latin America's history, remember, it was ruled directly by Spain. There was not a lot of self-government experience. Most of the population was very poor and illiterate, and they have this kind of shallow economy. It makes it easy for dictatorships run by these military caudillos to take over. And of course, slavery. Slavery will remain in Latin America. Gradual emancipation does take place just as it does in North America. And I want you to put a big star and maybe a couple underlines under this. This is a test question that I've seen before, and it's likely to be on your Unit 5 exam. We need to know the last state to abolish slavery in 1888. Easy year to remember. A lot of 8s there. In 1888, Brazil is the last state to abolish formal legal slavery. And of course it's Brazil, right? It's a sugar-producing colony. Its economic basis is sugar. Of course, it's going to be very difficult for Brazil to kind of extricate itself from that system. As we saw in the United States, it was a huge problem for us to extricate ourselves from slavery as well. We had a huge civil war in which over 600,000 people died in the effort to create a different economic form and system. And most former slaves, just as they do in North America, remain impoverished. Um, and this is going to be a long-term problem really throughout the Americas. The history and legacy of slavery will continue to sort of dog the countries throughout the Americas, even up to the present day. Um, all right, that is that in terms of Latin America. Um, I hope that you guys got a few things out of this. Just as reminders, please think about that tension between the classes. And I want you to understand Latin America's particular history, their background as a colony of Spain and Portugal without a lot of direct government control, um, and the sort of unique role, at least in Mexico, that the lower classes played.